Welcome, participants. Good afternoon and good evening, good morning to participants who are joining us online. Welcome to the fourth Translation for Impact webinar series that's brought to you by the Research Practice Policy Group at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. My name is Lorraine, and I'm your host and moderator for today's hybrid seminar entitled Evidence Ecosystem in Close-to-Practice Research, Conceptualizing and Maximizing Research Impact at the National Institute of Teaching. England, not Singapore. Singapore is NIE, National Institute of Education. Yeah. And this is truly a hybrid event because not only our participants are joining us today in person and online, but also our speakers. We have Professor Sin-Wang Chong here, joining us in person as our visiting scholar, and Doctors Calum, Davey and Ellen Turner are joining us online very early this Thursday morning in the UK. A very warm welcome to everyone who's here with us today. So before we begin this seminar, just allow me to go through some housekeeping matters. So first of all, please note that this session will be recorded. And so for online participants, if you do not wish to be recorded, please do turn off your cameras. And for participants with us, please let us know if you do not wish to have your photographs taken. And for online participants, if you have faced any technical difficulties, please let us know via the chat function, and then we will do our best to assist you. And for any questions that you would like to ask our speakers, please do so via the Q&A function. And for audience here, you will have the opportunities to ask the question live. Next is a very quick overview for today's program. I'll be doing a very quick introduction of who we are, as well as our speakers, before handing it over to Professor Chong for the session proper. And we should have about 20 to 30 minutes for questions at the end. Quick introduction about ourselves. The Research Practice Policy Group, or RPPG for short, we were set up last April to strengthen the research practice policy nexus by deepening the translation of education research and impact to bring Singapore's education practice to the next level. So what you see on the screen here describes our three main functions, which are dissemination through our products like SingTeach, which is an e-magazine meant for teachers. We also have journals that we co-publish with Taylor and Francis, social media like LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, X, etc. So do follow us on whichever platform that you are on for more information. We also do engagement and partnerships. We have, first of all, our biannual teacher-focused Redesigning Pedagogy International Conference. Happens every 2 years. The next one is happening in 2026. We also engage with discussions with researchers and partners on research impact. We broker collaborations with colleagues from the Ministry of Education and others. Finally, implementation and impact. We are also looking to implement a more systematic way of moving research, our research done locally, into our teaching programs, into schools, and documenting the impact of our research from our research projects and our partnerships, as well as engaging researchers to talk about planning for impact right at the onset of their research projects. So speaking of impact, it leads me to introduce today's hybrid seminar session, Evidence Ecosystem in Close-to-Practice Research. Prof. Chong and his colleagues will be with us to share what close-to-practice research is and also what its impact at the National Institute of Teaching in England. Let me introduce him properly. Prof. Sin-Wang Chong is top 2% researcher in education in 2023 and also 24 on the Stanford Elsevier list. Previously an associate professor at the University of Edinburgh, Sin-Wang is now the Director of Research and Director of Impact and Innovation at the International Education and Lifelong Learning Institute, University of St Andrews, Scotland. He's also the head of Evidence Synthesis and Chair of Research Ethics at the NIoT, National Institute of Teaching. His colleagues from the NIoT and co-presenters for today joining us online are Dr. Calum, Davey, Executive Director for Research and Best Practice, as well as Dr. Ellen Turner, Head of Evaluation and Observational Research. So without further ado, let's welcome Sin-Wang to begin his sharing with us. Sin-Wang, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for the introduction. Very tricky and lengthy title of the talk, but hopefully it captures what we plan to do and discuss today. First of all, thank you so much for being here, both in person and online. I would like to also say a big thank you to my colleagues in England, Calum and Alan. I can't really see you, but thanks for being part of this. It's very early in England. I know it's very cold as well. So really appreciate that. I also want to say a big thank you to the University of St. Andrews for supporting me to come over to Singapore to deliver this session. As Lorraine said, this talk is really about research impact. And there are a bunch of keywords here today that I would like to unpack a little bit. I'm going to first talk a little bit about what evidence is all about. And then I'm going to share my thoughts about what research impact is. And then I'm going to hone into what we call close to practice research. And after the first three parts of the webinar, I'm going to hand over to Calum and Alan to talk about examples from the National Institute of Teaching. I think for the first three parts, they are pretty basic conceptual things that you probably already know. But I think it's good to kind of rethink some of the key issues and questions. But I think what would be most interesting would be the examples that my colleagues are going to share. And afterward, we're going to have some time to kind of go over some of the challenges or reflections together with the audience here. I am a rather international person, I would say. I travel around the world to do research, talk to teachers, learn from teachers. I am from Hong Kong, and then I worked for a while in higher education in Hong Kong, working with teachers, teacher educators, do research as well. As you know, I also have a connection with the NIE in Singapore, so also do research and engagement stuff with them. And then I moved to Northern Ireland at Queen's University Belfast, again working with teachers and teacher educators, and then to Scotland, in Edinburgh, and then now St. Andrews. I'm also an adjunct academic in the US and the UAE. The reason I'm telling you a little bit about myself here and my kind of experiences is that there seems to be a common thread when I talk to scholars, teachers, policymakers in these countries who are very passionate about education, about improving the quality of teaching and learning. There seems to be talking about a lot about research and practice connection, or rather the lack of connection between research and practice. And that led me into this area of research impact that I'm increasingly more interested and passionate about. And that's why I would like to share with you a little bit about my thoughts. So the first thing that I would like to talk about is for us to think a little bit or rethink how we understand evidence. When we think about evidence, we usually think about a pipeline analogy. We think about how we start from conceptualizing an idea, thinking about the plan for kind of implementing the research and eventually producing that piece of work. It's rather unidirectional. And there is this emphasis on production of new knowledge. But at the same time, there is a lack of consideration of how evidence is translated, mobilized, and used. I think when I talk to a lot of my PhD students and scholars, we always talk about the end game as being publication. So academics are very interested in getting their work published in top journals, get their work cited. But I always challenge my colleagues to ask them what happened after publication. Is publication the end point of the research process, or actually that's the starting point of the research process? So that's something to think about. And when we think about evidence use or mobilization, I think this ecosystem analogy is pretty useful for us. A lot of us are thinking about, of course, creating new knowledge, But at the same time, there are different stages of evidence. So there is, of course, the stage where evidence gets synthesized, summarized, collated, and there is this evidence translation stage where we try to make evidence accessible to practitioners, policymakers, and eventually our aspiration is that the evidence can be used in classrooms by teachers and teacher educators. I find this evidence ecosystem very useful to help me think about what evidence is, because it emphasizes the flow of evidence. It prompts us to think about not just what research to do, but also usability of the evidence. If you look at a research publication, a journal article, how much stuff we can tease out that is usable and applicable to teachers. And I think a lot of us sitting here and online, from our experience, actually there isn't much from there. And that is a question. And that is something that we have to think about, because a lot of people put in a lot of time, effort, energy, money into a research project. How can we make the best use of it? So usability of evidence is very important. There's also this element of blending of evidence, is that we want to have a more micro overview of the international evidence base on a topic. And that's why it's important to kind of think about evidence syntheses and how evidence is combined and what we know about a topic around the world. But at the same time, also demand for evidence. And I think my colleagues are going to talk a little bit about setting research agenda for the National Institute of Teaching in England, and how we set our research agenda based on the needs of teachers and teacher educators. Sometimes when academics do research, their starting point is to think about what's the gap in the literature, what they are passionate about, but that may not necessarily be the same as the needs of teachers and teacher educators. So we have to think about demand of evidence as well. And a number of notions or concepts in this evidence ecosystem framework that I find quite interesting. One is what we call research waste or evidence waste. It's a rather harsh word to describe evidence that is subpar or studies that are not rigorous enough, or simply means that there are studies that duplicate with other research endeavors. So if we look at evidence as an ecosystem, we also have to look at how usable or not evidence is. And the second notion is really about the viscosity of evidence, that is to say the fluidity or the flow of evidence from academics to practitioners, policymakers, to teachers in the classrooms, and back to academics. So I think that kind of fluidity of evidence is very important. It's all about making connection. If we think about research impact, I think one of the key words definitely for me, it's connection among different professions and parties. And of course, thinking about the cost of doing research as well. So I think that touches a little bit on how I think about evidence and what evidence means to me. The next topic I would like to talk a little bit about is research impact. There are a lot of things that we can say about research impact. Perhaps these are some of the things that you think about if I say the words research impact. As Lorraine introduced, being a top 2% scientist is an honor, but does that mean impact? Does that mean impactful research? I'm not saying no, but it's a question, right? For those of you who are familiar with the UK system, maybe you've heard of REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which is a national research assessment exercise that is very high stakes for universities in the United Kingdom. And they talk about, 4-star international world-leading research. Does that mean it's impactful research? Or if you are an academic, you're familiar with the Web of Science database, journals that have impact factors, and we're always told that we need to publish in journals that have high impact factors. If I publish a piece of work in a journal with a high impact factor, does that mean my research is impactful? And then I came across this on X rather recently. I've kind of blinded some of the information because the focus is not on the person, but rather the phenomenon. So this is a post on X. Somebody posted saying they got 20 publications in 2024 so far, all in reputable outlets, none open access or predatory, fueled by many sleepless nights, incredible team, international collaborations. So that's really great, right? Very productive, right? And then if you look at this poster there, that the person is giving a talk on kind of publications, and the way that they were introduced. So they hold honorary positions at universities, they're postdoctoral associate, they publish more than 20 articles in SSCI Q1 journals, and they're editor-in-chief. So these are what people would think of when they think about research impact. Quantity of publications, for example, prestige of the journals that they publish in, but does that automatically translate into impact to the real world? How about this then? So this looks a little bit better because this is about communications of research findings. For example, communicating findings through emails to participants or posters, doing workshops with local community, or posting findings on Facebook groups, or doing interviews on local radio stations. So these are, of course, some of the activities that we will do and can do to make sure our research findings can be heard and understood by people outside of academia. But is that what research impact is all about? Another very useful way to think about it, I think in particular in UK higher education, we have been using this quite a lot, the UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals, where researchers are often asked to think about which of the goals your research is contributing to. And education obviously is one of them, and number 4. So that's another way to think about impact beyond academia, impact to society, economy as well. Personally, my reflection is I think research impact is multi-dimensional. There is, of course, the what there. If we look at the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals, that tells us the what, right? Is it economic, social, education, environmental impact we're thinking about? But there is also the when there, where there is short-term, mid-term, and long-term impact that we have to think about. And the where, so maybe our impact is more about addressing local needs, or perhaps national needs, or international needs. So that's the where. And also the how there. So one of the slides I talked about the how, different ways of dissemination, collaboration, translation, and advocacy work that we have to do. And the who, right? So who are the target audience? Are they practitioners, policymakers, media, or different communities? So I think there are 5 dimensions that we have to really think about when we talk about research impact. So what I'm trying to advocate for and what I'm trying to say here is that I think educational research needs to be impact-led. And what I mean by that is that if we want educational research to be meaningful, it has to prompt actions in order for research to drive meaningful change. And I think the second point is really important, is that research alone does not automatically translate into impact. I think that is very true. A piece of rigorously conducted research does not mean that it's impactful. I hope you agree with me. That's step number 1, well done, but there are steps to follow. And the third point is really the power of research impact in education lies in cultivating strong relationships. I think relationships are important when we talk about research impact. If you ask a school to try out things that your research suggests, they have to have that rapport and trust. You know, that's very important and very hard to cultivate. And the fourth point is also very important to me. I think in academia, we talk a lot about interdisciplinary research, but I would expand it even further to say there needs to be interprofessional research endeavors. So when it comes to translating evidence, we need other expertise. So for example, I was just talking to colleagues this morning. If you want to create a podcast for your research, you need somebody else to help you do that. If you want to create a website, a repository, a portal for your resources, you need somebody else to help you do that. So you cannot do it on your own. You need people who are not academics, but they have other expertise and skills that they can assist you to make sure your research reach more people. In other words, when I say impact-led educational research, I mean research needs to land, right? And a very key part of this is obviously about evidence translation. I think Lorraine has already talked a little bit, and I think that's one of the major tasks of her group is evidence translation, or some people call it knowledge brokering, evidence mobilization, research practice dialogue, research practice partnership. They mean pretty much the same thing. It's really about facilitating collaboration and dialogue among different stakeholders. And that's why I think the interprofessional notion emphasis is very important. It's not just about collaboration and dialogue, it's about thinking about how to use evidence or how to exemplify evidence. I think sometimes what is lacking in a piece of research report is exemplification, is that we may say, you know, doing intervention A is beneficial, but there is a lack of clear picture and idea about what A looks like in practice, or there can be different ways that intervention A, looks like. And I think there is an often ignored party in that research practice dialogue, and this is the third space colleagues. I don't know what it is called in Singapore here or in different parts of the world, but in the UK we call them third space staff. It's not a very nice way to call it, but I mean, it's a language that I have to use, but we use this to refer to university staff members who are not administrative staff per se. They're not academic staff, but they are educational developers. They're instructional designers. And I think they play a very key role in bridging the gap between research and practice, because on the one hand, they are aware of the research that is going on. They may have some basic research training that they are able to understand what findings mean, how to interpret them with caution. At the same time, they're very grounded. They are very experienced practitioners that they are able to translate that evidence into actionable information. So I think involving those people is also very important. And to me, again, I'm just reflecting personally how I understand evidence translation. I think it's a continuum. I think there is a very kind of small first step of basically simplifying research findings to make research findings accessible to non-academic audience. It can be an infographic, a flyer, a lay summary. So it starts with simplification and exemplification, right? And then the next level is conversation. So we try to create opportunities, again, the same word here, for interprofessional dialogues about research. What do you care in your context? And how can I assist in this regard? I think a lot of the examples of conversation have to do with what I'm interested in, what I want to do, what I'm good at. So I think it has to be a lot more about you, a lot less about me in these conversations. And then the next level is collaboration. That means from the conversation, maybe we identify topics of mutual interest and we decide to embark on some projects. It doesn't need to be research project per se, or research can be a component, but the projects need to be impact focused and action driven that involve an interprofessional team. And then the ideal is partnership. And partnership transcends collaboration. To me, partnership is about a culture of collaboration. It's part of it. It's part of what we do. It's part of our routine. And we already have a worked out mechanism for different professionals to work together. And it's sustained collaboration. I'm not sure whether, at which stage we think we are at in our own context, but I think it's a continuum. It will be unrealistic to say that, oh, we will start with a partnership model and say we want everybody to work together for the common good. I think that would be a little bit unrealistic, but I think it's, maybe better to start with the first step, of simplification, exemplification, and gradually moving towards partnership. I talk a lot about collaboration and dialogue, and I think there are different mechanisms or ways that dialogues and collaborations can look like, but I would like to focus on one of them, which is close to practice educational research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by this, because it's not a term that a lot of people use, but I want to kind of unpack this a little bit and kind of explain to you why I would like to use this term. And also it helps situate what Calum and Ellen will be talking about, the research projects that we do at the National Institute of Teaching. So close to practice research is about issues that are identified by practitioners as relevant to their practice. So it's a piece of research, but then the starting point of that research is not just about what's the knowledge gap in the literature. It's more about what are the problems faced by practitioners. What do you care about? What are the challenges? What are some of the things that you want to figure out? So we start with the practitioner's problem. So that's the starting point. And the process is a collaboration between people whose main expertise is research, practice, or both. So we're not essentially saying, so it's different from action research. So we're not saying that teachers need to do research themselves, because sometimes that's rather hard to do. But we're saying teachers will be involved in the research process, perhaps not in the data collection or analysis, but maybe at a later stage where they translate the evidence into artifacts or materials. And when we talk about close to practice research, we don't think about it as casual research or amateur research, as some of us may think when we think about teacher research. It's highly professional, it's highly robust in terms of research design, theory, and methods. It follows an iterative process of research and application. So I would say it's serious research, it's robust, rigorous research, but with the added benefit of having that issues or problems shared by the practitioners and having that application stage at the very end. In fact, if you look at the feedback from the 2014 Research Excellence Framework, which I mentioned earlier, the UK National Research Assessment Exercise, the assessors actually mentioned quite a number of outstanding examples of practice-focused research, and they identified the characteristics of these excellent practice-focused research, which includes co-production or collaboration between learners, teachers, and researchers. So the point here is really to say close to practice research can be excellent, high-quality research as well if it's done well. And this term, close to practice research, has been used by the British Educational Research Association quite a lot. This is a learned society in the UK where I'm heavily involved in. And in fact, in one of their journals, British Education Research Journal, they had a special issue dedicated to close to practice research. And in this editorial, I think the editors talk a lot about the importance of close to practice research and its value in bridging the gap between research, theory, and practice, and saying that at the crux of the educational landscape, it's all about making practitioners' voice heard and help to translate practitioners' knowledge and experience into theorized knowledge. I think there is also this kind of backward translation that we don't often talk a lot about. We always talk about from research to practice, but actually close to practice research has another function, is to kind of reverse translate it from action. So these are, theory and action or knowledge and action back to theorizable and conceptual knowledge. And this is basically just to talk about the value of close to practice research as relevant to both practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. I'm not going to go into this, but I would encourage you to check out this special issue. It's all dedicated to close to practice research, a lot of interesting stuff in there. It's not very recent, it's a few years back, but I think a lot of things are still relevant to us. And in the latest ethical guidelines for educational research published by the British Educational Research Association which I'm kind of involved in producing this. It's the fourth, I think it's the fifth edition, published April 2024 this year, so it's a very recent one. And this is the edition, one of the many additions to this edition. So if I can just read it aloud to you here. So it talks about community of educational researchers being considered to mean all those engaged in educational research, including students following research-based programs of study, independent researchers, and practitioners who undertake research, as well as staff who conduct educational research in their employment. And then the second part talks about the responsibility of established educational researchers to support the next generation of researchers, including practitioner researchers. So there is this element of researcher development there as well. If we are thinking about close to practice research, at the National Institute of Teaching, we also talk a lot about research literacy. It's about, thinking critically about evidence, not just doing what evidence tells you to do, but challenging it, think about your context and the applicability of the evidence in your own classroom. So just to summarize before I hand it over to my colleague is, again, how I see close to practice research as a continuum. Of course, it's research of education. So it's research that is about teaching and learning, right? That's the research that we're most familiar with, right? But perhaps research for education is something that we can also think about, is that the research is designed and implemented to improve teaching learning. That involves a dialogue with the teachers or teacher educators about the problems that they care a lot about. And then in an ideal world, we also want research as education. That means research as an integral part of teaching and learning. That's the ideal where we will think, oh, teachers or teacher educators, they're able to conduct their own classroom research, reflect critically about problems, collect data, analyze them, maybe not to publish in a highly cited journal, but to kind of reflect systematically on their practice to inform the next step. So I think this is how I understand close to practice research. So to kind of summarize, my section is really to contextualize for everyone, to share a little bit about my thoughts on what evidence means to me, what research impact means to me, and close to practice research as an example activity to potentially bridge research and practice. I'm sure these are thoughts that you have already thought about and heard and read, but as I mentioned earlier, exemplification is very important. So I think what I'm most looking forward to is actually the next section, which where my colleagues, Calum and Ellen, will be giving you examples of close to practice research that is conducted at the National Institute of Teaching, some of our reflections, and then we're going to kind of have a dialogue about it later. So I'll hand over to, I think, Calum first.
Thank you, everybody. That was a nice little break, time to digest what Sin-Wang has covered this morning. So to introduce myself, so my name's Calum Davey. As mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Research at the National Institute of Teaching. I'm grateful to Sin-Wang for inviting me and my colleague Ellen to join him in this talk today, and very honoured to be here at the NIE. It's a really exciting opportunity. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about the National Institute of Teaching and give you a couple of examples of the sort of close to practice-ness, the close to practice research that we do at the National Institute of Teaching. And then I'm going to hand over to Ellen, who's going to talk about a couple of example projects that we've got that will really sort of drill down and give exemplification of the kind of work that we do. So the first thing is that you won't have heard of the National Institute of Teaching, or it's very unlikely because we're really new. So the organization was founded about 2 years ago, really properly, by 4 multi-academy trusts. And multi-academy trusts in England are groups of schools, in this case, groups of between 30 and 50 schools, who work together to deliver a sort of shared and common education experience for children. And their main function, or the sort of primary reason why we have multi-academy trusts is to drive school improvement. And so these are trusts who were united in their aim that they wanted to bring about school improvement, especially for children from deprived backgrounds. And so they co-founded the National Institute of Teaching with the support of the British government. So those founding trusts have about 200 schools in total across the country, which includes primary schools, secondary schools, special schools, and other types of schools as well. And the National Institute of Teaching works with a affiliated network of what we refer to as associate colleges, which means that in total we are working with schools that serve about 500,000 children. So it's quite substantial. It's about 6% of all of the secondary schools in England. And what the National Institute of Teaching does primarily is deliver teacher training from the initial teacher education, so new teachers, right through to continuous professional development that even includes training for the CEOs for these multi-academy trusts. So a program which is a little bit more like a sort of MBA type thing. And we're delivering programs all the way through that sort of career-long professional development for teachers. Next slide, please, Ken. If you just bring up the 3 boxes, thanks. So this is just to sort of briefly give you an idea of where research fits in all of that. So we've got this school-based organization that delivers teacher professional development. And you'll see on the right here, we've got the vision. The vision of the organization is a school system that nurtures the talents of teachers and their leaders at all stages, so that we can provide children with the excellent education they deserve. The mission that we are on to achieve that is that we want to improve the quality of teacher and leader development at a system level in the United Kingdom. So although we deliver direct to thousands of participants at this point, we're also trying to act on the system overall. And we do that by generating and interpreting research. So this is where it links back to what Sin-Wang and Ellen and I are all working on at the National Institute of Teaching, which is to be generating and interpreting research and applying the insights to the design and delivery of our programs, but also sharing all that with the sector so that they can also benefit. Next slide, please. So this is the conundrum that we're trying to solve, really, and this goes back to the concept of close to practice research that Sin-Wang has introduced this morning, which is that what we want is to always be grounded in schools, and by schools we mean the sort of wider sector, really, but primarily in England, what we mean is schools. But we also want to be informed by research. We don't want our groundedness in schools to sort of disappear from the wider literature. And what the puzzle we're trying to solve at the National Institute is, can we make it such that being informed by research is the same as being grounded in schools? Can we conduct our research in such a way that actually what it does is bring us closer to practice, closer to schools, rather than further away as it can do? Next slide, please. So as Sin-Wang mentioned, we've done several things to try and achieve this closeness to practice, and I'll talk about 2 of them now. So the first one is the setting of a school-led research agenda. So as Sin-Wang mentioned, one of the key starting points in any piece of research is, what question are you asking? And very often that question is not set by anyone who's very close to practice. It's set by, sometimes it's by a funder who's got a particular interest, or it's by a researcher who's very curious about a particular piece of theory, for instance. And those are legitimate bases for making decisions. It's not to say that that's wrong. But what we wanted to do was to establish a school-led research agenda that we could always look back to and compare against when we're thinking about the questions that we're asking at the National Institute of Teaching, and also to share this with the sector in England so that other researchers could also think about how the questions they're asking relate to the questions that the practitioners have. So we conducted a project which we refer to as Closer to the Classroom, where we did surveys. sort of key informant interviews and facilitated some workshops and events to gather. I think we had in total about 2,000 responses, about 90% or so, of which were from teachers and leaders, which we then qualitatively analysed down to a set of themes. We ended up with about 20 themes, 20 questions that we felt were really strongly represented in that data. And then, next slide, please, Ken. We then took that and reflected on how how the National Institute could best address those questions, and came up with these 10 questions, which were both highly cited in the data from practitioners as being important questions, but also things where we felt we could make a difference. And I'm just going to flash this slide up rather than go through it, because I'm aware of the time. So that was really important, and that sort of set us up in terms of the types of questions we think we should be focusing on, certainly for the next 3 years before we refresh that process again. Another project that we've been doing, next slide please, Ken, has been to the other end of the research process. So we've thought about what questions we're asking, and now we're also thinking about how are we answering the questions. And one of the features of the multi-academy trust system in England is that they often collect data from children on a systematic level across all of the schools within the multi-academy trust. And this has created quite an unusual situation, which is that we have schools leading their own data collection across several settings, and in the kinds of numbers that would be suitable for conducting research. And these are assessment tools that are designed by the schools, by the curriculum leads, and so on in these schools. So they're highly relevant to the schools and their leadership, who are sort of laser focused on pupil outcomes and improving attainment, especially for deprived children. So these are really, really relevant outcomes to the school. But what has not been done before is that data has been used in any way by researchers to answer questions that are important to schools. For instance, how do we change any of these things? How do we improve outcomes based on these measures? So we have conducted a piece of work which we're calling Building the Teacher Education Dataset, which is by working with our 4 founding multi-academy trusts to turn their data into a research grade dataset. And so far what we've done is a sort of pilot for this. We've also conducted focus groups and interviews to make sure that we are not doing something that would be sort of unacceptable to teachers and to leaders. We think that's sort of okay. And we've looked at the data quality. So, and then finally, we've also used this data to estimate teacher impact, and I'll get to that in a second. But if we go to the next slide, please, Ken. So when we looked at this data, the first thing we noticed was that the assessments that were being used were maybe not actually quite at research quality. For instance, as you can see on this graph, you've got an assessment in the middle there, which is the English language in Year 7 assessment, which has the nice normal distribution of scores that you might expect. But on the other hand, there are tests on the right of the screen that are too difficult, and on the left of the screen that are too easy, and that's sort of evidenced by the way that the normal distributions are being cut off. And this has been one of the insights that have been really powerful and interesting for schools to learn about, because they wouldn't know this, and they haven't known this. And so what's been really useful is to feed this back and start having a conversation about their data. And what that really indicates is that where we want data to be of a certain quality, so do the schools. And so it's it's a really joint endeavor to improve things. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into sort of technical detail on this, but it's just a very pretty slide. So it's hard to resist putting it on screen. But you can read more about it in the full report online. But what we've done with this data is for the first time in England at this kind of scale, really for the first time certainly in Europe. We've managed to estimate what we're referring to as sort of teacher impact on these classroom assessments. So we've been able to look at how, using anonymized data, how different teachers vary in the value added that the children in their classroom get. And what this graph is showing is the sort of red line is actually just dots, and what that means is the sort of relative value add of the teachers in our schools. So on the right hand side, we've got the teachers who are, above the line and therefore having more impact than you do expect. And then on the bottom, on the left hand side, lower down, we've got the teachers who have less impact than we would expect. And so that's kind of interesting. So first of all, we're able to see that there is a bit of a difference. There are some teachers that are having more impact and some teachers that are having less. So we'll want to go and find out why that is. But what's also really interesting is that in this graph, we can see that the yellow dots show the value add associated with each of the classes that teacher teaches. And what we can see is that even if you look at the very far left, you've got teachers who are performing worse than their peers on average, but they have some classes they're performing above average. And similarly, on the right-hand side, you've got teachers who are very good, performing better on average than their peers, some quite a lot more, but they have some classes that are not doing so well. And so what we want to do is get into that and to explore it in more detail. And as I say, this is sort of an example of really getting close to the data that these schools are using in order to drive attainment for the deprived peoples that are their focus. And this kind of research is there to help that process and better understand what's going on at the teacher and the classroom level to hopefully feed back into changes that the schools can use in practice to improve outcomes. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea. I'm now going to pass to Ellen, who will talk to you about a couple of projects that we've got running, as well as this sort of bigger infrastructure work that we're doing at the National Institute. Ellen.
Thank you, Calum. I'm just going to take a moment to pause as well and check that everyone can hear me in the room. Can you hear me clearly? Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks so much, Calum. And just to echo Calum and Sin-Wang's sentiments, really honoured to be here today. This is really exciting to talk to yourselves in the room and online, and to have the chance to reflect on some of the learning that we're undergoing at the moment in the National Institute of Teaching. So my name is Ellen Turner. I'm Head of Evaluation and Observational Research at the NIoT in England. And as Calum sort of outlined, at the National Institute of Teaching, we have most of the organisation really is teams that are designing and delivering teacher training and development programmes. And then my team, the Evaluation and Observational Research team, is really the research team that conducts primary research alongside the colleagues that are designing and delivering programmes. So the role of the Evaluation and Observational Research team is really to be working very closely with our colleagues that are designing and delivering programmes, as I mentioned. And that's really exciting. It's a kind of new approach to doing it. It's a new organisation in England, so we work sort of under the understanding that we're learning as we're going, and that what we're doing are all sort of learning opportunities, any challenges that we face. And we also work with the value of kind of leaving our egos at the door. So that we are all sort of approaching this question of research practice partnerships with an open mind and a learning sort of mindset. And so, as I think Sin-Wang's presentation and Calum as well has outlined, that what we're trying to do here is we're in quite an interesting position in that we are doing rigorous academic research and we want to speak to academic communities, but we're also doing research that is for and with teachers, and that is answering questions that teachers really want answered in the classroom. That's in the broader context, as Calum outlined, with the Closer to the Classroom report, but also on more specific issues like the questions I'm going to talk about in these two research projects. That isn't always easy. And as I mentioned, that's where the sort of learning mindset and leaving the egos at the door comes in really handy, because it's important as we approach these questions. So I'm going to talk about two projects that we've conducted over the past academic year. These are our first two of four first research projects at the National Institute of Teaching and the evaluation team. And both of the projects that I'm talking about today are very closely tied to research practice projects, and they're conducted within the context of recent policy changes in England, that has been in place since 2019. So the first project I'm going to talk about is the one on the slide here. So this is around supporting early career teachers in rural and coastal areas in England. And this is in the context of a policy reform that came in 2019 that provides a package of support for teachers in their first 2 years of teaching. And there were national evaluations that found it had huge potential, was really valued, but it had issues around increased workload for early career teachers and their mentors. But we didn't have insight into what that looked like for teachers in particularly rural and coastal communities in England. Ken, could you bring up the next box, please? So this was a one-year collaborative study. It was led by the National Institute of Teaching, so by the evaluation team, and by our colleagues in the Early Career Framework, that's the programme team within the National Institute. And two of our organisations that we work with in particularly localised areas across the country where the National Institute doesn't have a base. So one is the South West Institute for Teaching in Devon, and the other is the David Ross Education Trust in North and North East Lincolnshire, so the North East and the South West of England. And this research project, the way in which this is particularly the way the research practice partnerships works for this project is that we work therefore very closely with two organisations that are working with schools in particular areas on a daily basis and are very, very closely connected to those schools, and with representation of school and multi-academy trust organisations in our research advisory group. And the question itself for this project actually came from conversations with colleagues in schools. And this is, again, one of the really nice things that the National Institute is able to do in the way that we work, is respond to questions as they come up. In this case, our colleagues at the South West Institute for Teaching said to us, we are speaking to schools that are saying we're really struggling to deliver this new framework in small schools in rural and coastal areas. And the South West Institute for Teaching mentioned that to us, and this came out of the discussions that we have. So it wasn't a systemized approach, it was something that came out through the day-to-day nature of our work, that this is a really important area to focus on and we need to learn more about this. Ken, could you bring up the next slide, please? Brilliant. So this was a mixed method study, as you can see here. So we did surveys across the country and we did qualitative research in particular areas. We did this in 9 schools across 6 multi-academy trusts. And the areas if you see on the right-hand side, we were supported by a research advisory group, which is another way in which we wanted to make sure this project stays very close to schools. So we had colleagues working in schools, multi-academy trusts, in the areas you can see in blue, and the orange areas are where we did the research. So we were intending to make sure that the research and the research advisory colleagues were very closely aligned. So in this project, there were lots of opportunities and some challenges, as I mentioned. So the opportunities here were that we knew we were answering a question that was genuinely really important for schools, and it was important to advocate for experiences that schools were having, as well as turning what we found into strategies to support schools. Thank you. And it was in collaboration. Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. As I mentioned, it was in collaboration with organisations very closely working with those schools. That's a brilliant opportunity, enriches the research. The research advisory group, for example, and our colleagues at the 2 delivery partners, that they were challenging us at every step of the way, saying, is this useful? This is the kind of language that schools and teachers are going to respond to, and kind of throwing up questions along the way that really guided us to make sure the research was as useful as possible. And as I mentioned, it's guided by this research advisory group. The challenges here were firstly, I think the first one to mention is around colleagues' time and capacity for research. And this is something that it's, as researchers, we had the time allocated to do this project, our colleagues didn't. And this means that we are in it all the time, we're thinking about it, we've got lots of ideas, we want to discuss with our colleagues, and it's really easy to forget that when your colleague who is literally in a school or is a teacher educator and is busy dealing with the sort of the day-to-day of what teacher education looks like, drops into a meeting with around research and may have completely forgotten or not have at the forefront of their mind what we're thinking about all the time as researchers. And it's really easy to kind of forget that. And I think one of the things that we've really learned as a team through this project is the importance of communication approaches that really respects colleagues' time and what colleagues that are involved in the teacher education practice, what they are dealing with on a daily basis, and making sure that the way we communicate is genuinely useful to those colleagues. And I think one of the sort of key tensions there is juggling or finding the balance between respecting that colleagues don't have a lot of time to engage in research, but that you want to make sure that the really key decisions and the real like heart of the project, that is where the collaboration is around. So the fact that colleagues don't have that much time doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing a really collaborative approach when it comes to the key decisions of the project. So that requires being really organised and thinking ahead. And using meeting times and things like that in a way that is as useful as possible to really get to the most important aspects of the research. And I've put here just a couple of other challenges that we know are part and parcel of doing education research. So challenges in response rates and finding interested participants to participate in qualitative research. That was, I think, easier in this context because we were working very closely with these organisations close to schools. But as in any project, it wasn't easy. And we're still thinking of ways to strengthen participation in research. Okay, Ken, could you bring up the next slide, please? Would you mind bringing up the other two boxes as well? Thank you. So this, I'm going to talk now about a second research project, and this was slightly different in the sense that the last one was around being really close to schools and to organisations that work closely with schools. And this research project was done, I would say, the nature of the research practice partnership here was more the close collaboration between the research team and the initial teacher education faculty within the National Institute of Teaching. So this is us working very closely with our colleagues who are providing ITE and building in research into that process. This project looked at delivering virtual school visits as part of to observe expert practice in the classroom and compared virtual versus in-person approaches to doing that. And this is in the context of recent policy changes as well in England. And so this, I think the main thing to say about this is it's a randomized controlled trial, and we were embedding a randomized controlled trial of these two approaches into routine course delivery in ITE. And this is really the first time that it's been done in this particular way in England. And we've learned a huge amount as we've gone. And I think one of the things that we should sort of say up front is randomized controlled trials are, of course, notoriously inflexible. There are a set of, in order to have rigorous research, there are lots of things that can't be sort of compromised on. And in the first year, for this project, this was the first year of ITE course delivery at the National Institute of Teaching. And so we were really learning about how to do that at the same time. And this, again, the amazing opportunities to do this. So it's so exciting to be embedding randomized controlled trial methodology in routine ITE delivery. And there's also been opportunities to feed in what we found kind of in real time into the design of future initial teacher education. And we were lucky enough to work with our colleagues who are tutors on the programme, actually in being involved in directly collecting data for the trial. There were, of course, challenges with this. So firstly, some of the same challenges that I think I mentioned with the previous project, but this one was more around working with our internal colleagues, but with where we have different timelines and priorities. And I should say this project and the challenges we faced is really in the context of a huge amount of goodwill, support for the research practice partnerships across all our teams, and a real appreciation and support for why it's so important. And still, it's really hard to align when IT course delivery has its own timeline, and that can change, and there are a huge amount of people involved in any changes to the timelines. So for example, trainees, tutors, mentors and schools, that can affect a huge amount of people. Of course, for the research timeline, any change to the IT timeline can really throw off some of the trial methodology. So that's been something that we've been having to negotiate, and same with priorities. Time and capacity has been, we've faced sort of the same difficulties here, in the sense that the research team holds most of the time for doing the research, but we can't and don't want to do it without our colleagues kind of coming in for the really key decisions. So again, we've been learning how to do that. And something just to add as well is that the National Institute of Teaching is a new organisation, and we mostly work remotely. We work across the whole of England. We're a national organisation, so a lot of the work we do is done remotely, and that has can hinder sort of communication and clarity about exactly what's going on. But as I said, this is all in the context of us learning as we go. We've learned a huge amount about how to embed a randomised control methodology within initial teacher education. And that has led to, we successfully conducted the trial. And at the moment, we're sort of sharing the findings with the sector and with our internal colleagues at the National Institute of Teaching in the ITE team. I think that's me. I think I'm out of time. Very happy to answer any questions on these two projects. And again, thank you. It's wonderful to have a chance to reflect and share these learnings.
Am I connected? So we are kind of in a limbo, because you can hear me here. You can also hear me online. Testing. Well, it's still happening. Can I just check if people online can hear me?
I can hear you.
Thanks so much, Calum. So people on site just have to bear with me. You can hear me double times. Yeah, so thank you very much, Sin-Wang, Calum, and Ellen, for sharing with us your experience and also what you are doing at the NIoT. Yeah, so before we begin with the Q&A section, we would really like to ask for your help to complete the feedback form, because that's really important to us, to help us to know how we can improve. And also bearing in mind, this is our first hybrid seminar. So we're trying to work out a lot of technical issues. So please do share your feedback with us. And at the end of the feedback submission, you will be able to download the slides that the presenters have shared today. Yeah, so just to give you maybe about 5 seconds. It doesn't take 5 minutes. Sorry, responding to people here who are a bit unhappy. Okay, so next, I'm going to moderate this session very quickly, and hopefully I don't have to talk so much, and then pass it on to Sin-Wang, Calum, and Ellen. And they have kind of prepared 2 questions really to think about the things that they have taught or shared about. So one of the things is, what are some of the challenges for engaging practitioners and researchers in close practice research, as well as how can we make research evidence useful and usable to teachers and teacher educators? Yeah, so I'm not sure, Sin-Wang, would you like to begin, or would you like to ask Calum or Ellen to share?
Yeah, I can. Okay, that happens to me as well. Okay. All right, so I'm trying to, all right, it's working now. No more echo.
I switched it, yeah.
Okay, so can people online hear me all right, just to make sure?
Yep,
Yes,
I can hear
okay,
you.
perfect. So I guess this is more of a dialogue, not just involving me, Calum, and Ellen, but also I would welcome everyone online or in the room, if you have any thoughts or further questions about these two big topics, please put the questions in the chat, and hopefully Ken or somebody can kind of feed that back to us. But I think, shall we start with the first question about what are the challenges for engaging practitioners and researchers in close to practice research? I think Ellen mentioned a number of challenges already in the two examples. I think time and also kind of having different priorities and having that, challenges of communicating. I think that's definitely some of the major challenges. I wonder if I can ask maybe Ellen or Calum to say a bit more about how you navigated those challenges, because you mentioned the challenges, but now you have the two reports. The projects have been completed, so they have been quite successful. So what did you do to eventually kind of make it work? I become the moderator, which is weird, but I hope that's okay.
Thanks, Sin-Wang. Is that question first to me, and then maybe Calum?
Yeah.
Thanks. This is a really great question. I think one of the things, and I was looking at the second question here, thinking this is probably how I would answer this one as well, is really around, I think you kind of framed it really nicely in your presentation as well, Sin-Wang. It's around the context that the research has taken place with from the beginning. So it's like setting a context and the strong relationships that the research is taking place in. And I mentioned in both the studies actually the strong feeling of goodwill and appreciation for or support for the research and why it's important, and that sense of we're sort of in this together. We're a team doing it. Of course, we're being pulled in different directions, and that's not always easy. But I think developing that context is really the important thing from the beginning. And it's kind of that context and having that strong enables you to deal with any challenges that then will inevitably arise. I think the other thing is highlighting as well throughout that we are all learning how to do this, and I think in sometimes when you're in meetings and you get difficult questions, that's an indication that the team has created an environment where difficult questions can be raised and challenging conversations can be had, and that's really important to do. I think is to make sure that you're highlighting that we are all learning, that difficult questions are welcome, and then we can change something on the back of that, and that iteratively the team is designing a way of doing research practice collaborations in a good way. I think that's another thing that I would add. And I think ensuring a part and parcel of that is ensuring that the research question itself, which as you linked to, Calum, I think in your Closer to the Classroom report, the importance of knowing that from the outset, the question is something that is owned by all members of the team and by the users of the research. It's not something that has come more from the research colleagues than anyone else in the partnership. I think that's also really important. Don't know if you'd want to add anything to that, Calum.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks, Sin-Wang, for the question. So I would probably take a slightly different angle on this, and I sort of throw this back to the room and to everyone online, and it was sort of inspired by this hybrid session and the challenges that minor challenges, but the technical issues that we're having occasionally, which is to say that it's obviously, well, it's not obviously, it is really valuable to me and to Ellen to be able to be here online and to communicate with you, and really appreciate it, and really appreciate the sort of extra work that you've had to do to make that happen. So that's great, and I think everyone who's joining online probably feels similarly, and as well as people in person. So there's a lot of different ways that we're all engaging with this session just now. But that doesn't mean that everybody is able to be here. That doesn't mean that everyone is able to engage. And what this feels like an example of, to me, is of the problem that we have, especially in our Closer to Classroom research and our teacher education data set, which is about who are the practitioners we're talking about and who are the researchers that we're working with. Because we can say practitioners and researchers, and we can find representatives of each of those groups, but they're never sort of complete. And so for example, for the practitioner point of view, we went out and asked teachers and teacher educators about the questions that they have. But it wasn't a sort of random sample or a census. This was something where we're very likely to have been quite influenced by the people who are already quite engaged with research and already thinking about research quite a bit. So that's the problem. And then on the researcher side, I mean, in the UK anyway, the education research community can be quite parochial, and especially as you get sort of closer to practice, because there becomes this sort of sense that the only evidence that comes from England or from somewhere down the road or whatever is relevant here, because it's all so complicated and contextually dependent. And then that limits the amount of conversations that we can have with colleagues, for instance, like yourselves in Singapore, and really draw on the expertise there, or include you and your colleagues as the researchers in that conversation about research and practice. So for me, a big challenge that is like still out there and I don't know the solution to is, how do we make sure that we've got really good representation among practitioners, but also not become too sort of closed-minded when it comes to who do we include in terms of researchers? It's a more question than an answer, but back to you.
No, I think that's super helpful in terms of kind of telling everybody here, online and in person, that we don't have everything figured out. And I think that's the joy and fun of doing close to practice research, very much like teaching, right? We don't have it all figured out. We don't have all the questions answered. Sometimes the answers are different, right? So to me, that's the fun and interesting bit of doing kind of research practice partnership. I would like to just add to what Calum and Ellen said, just a few points here. First, I don't know whether you were aware when Calum and Ellen were talking about the projects or the Institute, we mentioned a few times that we are a very young and new organization. A number of times, almost as if we're quite proud of this. And I think being a young organization has its advantages, that the culture is still not fully shaped and kind of cemented. It can be nurtured, it can be molded, and everybody is quite open-minded about different ways of working, and we have that capacity to try different things, not just to do different projects, but try different things of working together. I remember Calum talked a lot about ways of working between the research team and other teams within the organization. It's a big topic we talk about every time when we meet together, is how do we want to work with the rest of the organization? And I think that's an advantage of being young as an organization. The second point is really picking up from what Ellen said about the two projects. I think there needs to be mechanisms in place to facilitate that research practice dialogue. But I think that mechanism sometimes, of course, a very top-down systematic mechanism is helpful. For example, we have constant meetings with colleagues, or we have different opportunities and events to mingle, or setting the research agenda. That's very good and useful. But I also think it's equally important to have more kind of bottom-up, informal, organic, just tea and coffee chats about what we value, what are our priorities. And I think that came up in Ellen's presentation about, having the advisory group talking to the research team about some of the concerns that they want to be addressed in rural and small schools. I think that's very important. So it's about a balance between, top-down and bottom-up kind of mechanisms in place to facilitate dialogue. The third thing is, I think, what Ellen said about leaving our ego at the door. And I think that's very important. And that's something I have to acknowledge, that there is much for me to learn as an academic, that we're quite used to. I mean, I myself, I don't want to generalize, but I am quite used to thinking about what I want to do, what I'm good at doing, what is good for me. And then I go and do it. And I ask teachers to help me do it for my benefit. But that's not really quid pro quo per se. It's really what I want to do. But there needs to be occasions where I become the support, that I go and humble myself and ask people, what do you need? I don't know the answers. I don't know what sort of research questions I have to ask. I actually don't know who I can approach to do the project. Can you tell me more about your experience? Can I learn from you? So I think that is so true to me as a researcher, is that there's so much knowledge out there in schools that I don't have access to, if not because of the colleagues at the National Institute who teach on those programs. So I think leaving our ego at the door, it's a very nice way to summarize it. So I'll just add to that.
Thanks so much, Sin-Wang. And I really like that phrase as well. And I'm actually going to ride on that because we've researchers and we've also got partners joining us in person and online. So I wanted to just explore a little bit, Sin-Wang, you kind of shared a little bit already, but I wanted to explore a little bit about the mindset shifts in researchers as you are involved in the NIoT. What are some of the things that needed to shift in order for you to do close to practice research? Yeah, so you said a little bit, Sin-Wang, but I don't know whether you want to add on to it, and then before we invite Ellen and Calum.
Yeah, sure. I think Ellen and Calum can say a bit more about their experience. I think the three of us share a little bit in terms of background, that we all come from an academic background. We both work or used to work in higher education institutions. I think for me, the mindset shift is very much about, I don't know a lot of things, and I don't have everything figured out. And I become actually quite vulnerable in a sense that a lot of things are beyond my control. I have to go and talk to people more, whereas in the past I was quite used to working in my own office and just look at my computer and do my own thinking. But there is a lot of thinking that can be done by talking to different people. So I think that's very important. And also doing research at the NIoT, the close to practice research, it's all about working together. It's about brainstorming ideas together. And sometimes your ideas get accepted, your ideas get changed, your ideas get further developed. And it's a very good experience to me to keep an open mind. And also to think about learning from other people, because I think we're so used to, as researchers, to teach other people things because we think we know more. But to me, with the National Institute in the past years, I have learned that there's so much I can learn from other people by asking a lot of questions. For example, I invited Ellen at the very last minute because I had a conversation with her. I learned about what she was doing. I thought that was very good experience, very rich examples that could benefit the audience here. I learned something from my colleagues, and that's a very different mindset. But I have to say this, that to me personally, I embrace both worlds. I enjoy working in academia, doing world-class research, being able to talk to researchers around the world, at the same time being very grounded. Sometimes you feel like you're up there if you talk too much with academics, but sometimes colleagues at the National Institute kind of pull me down a little bit back to the ground and ask me difficult questions. And I think that helps with my own CPD as well. I'm going to hand over to Calum and Ellen. Maybe their stories are slightly different.
Thanks, Sin-Wang. I can go first. I mean, first of all, just to say that I feel like you've put it really, really well, and that it's interesting and very familiar to hear your thoughts about the experience of coming from the sort of academic mindset to this sort of slightly different mindset and the sort of challenges and the balance you try and get in that context. I agree with you. I think the only thing I would add really is to say my experience. So I used to work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine for about 15 years, and I very, very sort of like research academic-y environment. And my experience there was that at any one time, everyone or many people in the conversation had sort of similar skills and backgrounds and sort of so we so often although we did work with partners and so on, even where we did, they were usually academic partners in other universities around the world, and so we'd be all sitting around discussing methods or questions or stuff, but we'd all be coming very much the same sort of point of view. So it was it didn't feel like we were necessarily sort of complementing one another as so much as sort of competing with one another. I mean, working together, but kind of overlapping in our skills. Now I'm at the National Institute of Teaching, and I'm very, very often in conversation and working in teams where, yeah, I do know some stuff, but I'm working with people who know totally different stuff, and I don't really know any of their stuff. And a lot of the time I feel like a complete novice. I'll be learning about whole new really important things for the first time, even after a couple of years working at the Institute. And I'm sort of having to accept that that's okay, and that that's not because I'm terrible at my job or because I'm like missing something, but that I have something to offer with my sort of research background. But at the same time, you know, have to really be open to the idea that there's a lot of other stuff. In fact, possibly a majority of other stuff that I don't know about, and that other people do. And so it's just making the space for that sort of true collaboration to happen. Ellen?
Thanks, Calum. I definitely agree with you both. You've summed it up so well. I've got a couple of small things I'd probably add to that as well, which is one, which I think you mentioned right at the beginning of your talk, Sin-Wang, which I completely agree with, which is we're so used to, I also come from an academic background working at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as well. And we're so used to thinking of the outputs of our research being journal articles, and then to move it, and we still want to do that at the National Institute of Teaching. We're still speaking to academia, but to work in an environment when that's really not the focus, and if it's not useful for teachers like right now, like yesterday, then it doesn't have the same, we're not talking about something that lands in the same way. And so sort of seeing what the outputs of research, or changing the way you see the outputs of research and what usefulness looks like. And then just to add to that as well, probably on a more personal note from my own experience. So I'm a sociologist, and I'm used to getting like really stuck into social theory and finding it all really exciting, and kind of having the not necessarily the freedom, but the space maybe to focus on that, and that focusing on theory and contribution to learning is an end in itself. And I think one of the shifts that I've sort of experience working at the National Institute of Teaching and with teacher educators and teachers as close colleagues and collaborators is why is theory useful? And is the question that's always at the forefront of my mind is that thought that you're pursuing, is that useful? And of course there's a balance and a tension to be reached there, but that's quite a shift for me as a sociologist, to be always thinking, and how could someone apply that, and you know, is that genuinely going to be changing practice on the ground? So that's something that I'm holding in tension in my mind as well.
Just to sum up, so really it's a willingness to be open, to be humble, to be listening, and really acknowledging that we don't know everything that's out there. Yeah, so for the sake of our participants who are not researchers, but really on kind of like the partnership end of things, what are some things that you have found helpful on the partners' end to actually facilitate the partnerships that you've enjoyed so far?
Yeah, I think probably Lorraine, you know a bit more about this than me, because you have done so much on this. But I think, and probably Ellen as well know a bit more. But I can start with a few thoughts. I think, again, just looking at what the National Institute has been doing, I think sometimes we cannot be so goal-oriented and say, you know, our goal is to have that partnership. So we're trying to come up with events and functions and, you know, mechanisms to facilitate a partnership for the sake of getting a research project done. I think sometimes it has to be about relationship building. And so one example that I can share is, or two examples. One is that the National Institute of Teaching has recently started a teacher researcher reading group. So it's an opportunity for not just the programs colleagues and research team colleagues, but also tutors from our associate colleges as well who would like to join online to look at a piece of research together, to talk about the questions. And to me, I didn't attend all the sessions, I attended one of them. And I was fascinated by this because the piece of research almost becomes not so important. It's an anchor for people to talk about things that mean a lot to them. The specific findings of the research, not important. The methodology, not important, but it's a stimulus for people to talk about things that they care about. And we had teaching colleagues to choose the topic and the articles, and you know, so it's a very nice occasion. the goal is really not to, hey, we want to form a partnership because we have a project. So can you please sign up at the end of the reading group to be part of the team? That's not that. It's really just to facilitate that dialogue. I think that's very important. The second thing is, again, it's similar to the first example. It's something that is very organic and informal. So I still remember one of the projects that my team is doing, just recently finished, is a meta review on teacher education, which is a huge evidence synthesis. We look at almost 400 reviews and looking at all literature reviews on initial teacher education and CPD globally. And then we wanted to take this as an opportunity to introduce to teaching colleagues what evidence syntheses are all about. So we open it up to colleagues to say, hey, if you're interested in getting to know more about how to do a synthesis, if you want to drop in and do a part of it, you're most welcome to join us. So there isn't a commitment to become a researcher and to engage in a year-long project because they're not paid to do that, but they can dip in and out. But they have a taste, oh, this is what synthesis looks like. It's so boring and dry that I would never do it again. That's a good experience. Or they end up saying, it's so boring and dry that I'm so glad that we have researcher colleagues who will do that. Then that's also a very good outcome. Or they become fascinated by the process and they become a researcher. They want to spend their own time on doing a synthesis themselves. And that's also a very good outcome. So I want to share these two examples. But I'm sure Ellen probably has more to say because she has always been at the forefront of communicating with our programs colleagues. So I don't know, Ellen, if you want to say something.
Thanks, Sin-Wang. Yeah, happy to come in as well. I think interesting to hear your examples too. So I think one of the things that I would say, having been a practitioner myself, I was a teacher, secondary school teacher before, is just keeping in mind what it feels like to teach a day of lessons and then to jump into a meeting that's about something completely different and can feel quite abstract, and knowing that research and like the terminology, the way we talk about research can be quite alienating and intimidating when you're not sort of in it all the time. And I think that's I would come back to communication styles and approaches really and say we'll link back to what I was saying in the presentation around using colleagues' time really, really well. So if you have 15 minutes with a colleague, what do you want to present and how do you want to present it that gets so it enables the colleague to really engage with what you're saying in the most meaningful way, and that I guess I would take the view that if it's alienating and it's confusing to a colleague who has literally just dropped into it, having dropped so many other things going on at the same time, then the way you're presenting it is wrong, and it needs to be presented in a way that is easy to engage with when you're just dropping into it. And that some strategies, I guess I would say, is if you're writing an academic paper as a team, I would always try and say you have half an hour with a colleague who's a teacher educator or a teacher. Think about how to use that half an hour in a way that supports engagement with the ideas behind the paper. And as the researcher, you might go away and do the legwork, but really make sure the key decisions and ideas are presented within that half an hour to enable the colleague to take part in that within that space and not asking for things around the outside, and ideally not going over the 30 minutes exactly. So it's sort of respect for time, communication approaches that aren't alienating and that are kind of really clear and enable participation, and in a format that supports that as well.
Thank you very much. Helen, anything to add?
Thank you. On the point about timeliness, I won't take up any more time because I know we're coming to the end, but only to say that we don't have any of the answers. If people online or in the room have any ideas, please talk to us. We're really at the very early stage of this, and I'm sure there's a lot more we could do. Thank you.
Let me just switch the speaker a bit. I'm learning as I go along. So I'm just going to extend this for about maybe 5 minutes just to see if anybody live has any questions that you want to ask? Darren? I'll pass you the mic.
Okay. Right. Hi. You can't see me. Can you? Have I? No, it's okay. It's fine. You can. Oh, hi. So Darren from MOE. Just curious about close to practice research. You mentioned that the problems of practice. So in that sense, how do the practitioners know what they don't know in terms of the problems that they could be solving. So how does the researchers sort of negotiate this process for them to develop some of those problems to which it might not be on their horizon yet or in their context? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think to me it's as I said, it's the reverse translation that we haven't really talked about. We always talk about translating evidence into practice, but also that entails, of course, researchers have to do a lot more in communicating research findings to practitioners. But at the same time, there's a lot of work that practitioners need to do. And one thing I talked about earlier is their research literacy, how they understand research evidence when they look at a piece of article. Are they able to kind of understand, for example, the quality of the evidence, how that relates to their own practice, and tease out the kind of practical bits? So being critical about the evidence or the suggestions presented to them. I think at the moment, it's almost like, I agree with you, sometimes teachers don't know what they don't know, and they're actually quite happy with how things are done because they've been doing it for decades and it's fine. Then there is not that impetus to change if it's not a policy requirement. But through engaging them with reading research more critically and connecting the findings with their practice, I think there is a chance for them to kind of think more about the practice. Just for example, if they read a study about the same thing that they are doing, for example, mentoring in another context, and it's up to them to make that connection. It's not really something that we can teach them or we can say, well, here's an infographic that will help you make the connection. No, that would just help them understand the content of the article a bit more, but the practitioners have to do a lot of work themselves. And this is something I think we need to kind of explore more. Calum and Alan, not sure whether you have anything to add to that.
Thanks. I've got a couple of things to add. So first of all, is to say I think it's a really, really good question. So thanks for making it. Two, I don't know the answer, but two reflections. So one is that when we presented back our school-led evidence agenda research questions to some of our research colleagues, we have a research advisory group, for instance, some of them did say those aren't very good questions, and they might not be. And I think one of the pieces of feedback we had was that practitioners may be good at talking about lots of things, but specifying answerable research questions might not be that. And so maybe when we do this again, which we will, we might want to think about how do we build more on the kind of stuff that Sin-Wang's been talking about, more about relationship, more about co-production, and less as we did in that project about just kind of like gathering in data and then sort of sifting through it, which may have not resulted in what we really wanted. So I think there's and I think that relates to solving the problem that you've raised there about do you know what you don't know. I think the other thing is, and I don't know what it's like in Singapore, but in England, part of the as Sin-Wang mentioned, it's quite possible that people practitioners will say that there are things that they think they know and that don't need to be questioned. And some of that will be because of experience or because it's how their school always does it or whatever. But what we have as well at the moment, I would argue, is a bit of a tendency in England to talk about evidence as sort of ending curiosity rather than being the beginning of curiosity. So I think there's probably quite a few things where teachers would say, oh no, but we know that because the evidence says such and such, rather than, really critically engaging with it, as Sin-Wang mentioned, or thinking about what new questions that evidence brings up and that we could continue to ask. So I think there's an inclination at the moment to use evidence to close down questions rather than open them up, and that's something that we're sort of trying to grapple with. And Sin-Wang's mentioned it a few times in terms of evidence literacy and research literacy. Ellen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just briefly, I really like that point about evidence being the heart of the sort of genesis of curiosity, not the end of it. I think I'd only just add on like particular evaluation projects. I think there's there's a role that researchers can play to facilitate really good workshops and discussions with practitioners, I think. And I'm imagining, so if you're starting a project and you might want to work on a theory of change, I think there's a role researchers can play in asking questions and generating a discussion through a workshop that can lead to deeper sort of questioning with colleagues coming from practice. And that's also a role that researchers can play, I think, as well, is to support workshops around what kind of questions to ask. But again, I agree, this is a really good question.
Thank you very much, Calum. Just to say that the situation in Singapore is similar to what you're experiencing in England. But yeah, I really concur with everything that all of you shared. And it almost seemed like practitioners also need to have that mindset shift in having that research literacy and also learning to find out what they don't know and then finding the answers for them as well. So thank you very much. And on this note, I really do need to end. I thank you everyone for being with us, for staying on for the extended time. Please, for those in person, please help yourselves to the food. For those online, please help yourself to a cup of tea that you make for yourself. And we do hope that you join us for the next session as well. And please do remember to follow us on social media, but also at the same time, share with us your feedback for this seminar. And once again, I want to thank you, all our speakers. So please join me in giving all of them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.